with all of you this morning, and it is so nice to be back in California. Not originally from California, but I went to seminary here. And one of the reasons that I'm excited to be back in California, I don't know if you know this, but California is home to the place I have found that is the very best for people watching in all of the places that I have ever people watched. I'm not kidding you. In Berkeley, California, on the Euclid Street, there's a little coffee shop called Brood Awakening. And Brood Awakening is right in the middle of the Graduate Theological Union, which is a consortium of 9 different seminaries, everything from Jesuits to Buddhists. It's also in the middle of the Berkeley College of Engineering, and not very far from the BART station. So you have everyone that takes public transit, all of the seminarians, and all of the engineers, and you know what it takes for good people watching? A lot of different people mixing together. My friends in seminary and I used to sit on outside in little tables at Brood Awakening and play people watching games. And our favorite people watching game was called Patron, Saint, or Deity. And in Patron, Saint, or Deity, the goal is to watch somebody walking by and assign them a patron, saint, or deity based on your first impression of them. So if there were a strapping Scandinavian-looking person who looked like they might be heading to crew practice in the bay, we might assign them something from the Norse pantheon. Or if there were a self-confident looking woman with a killer fashion sense, we might say that her patron saint was Gloria Steinem. You get the gist. So one day I was playing this game with people from religions that actually had patron saints and deities. And they said to me, Julie, what is the patron saint of Unitarian Universalism? Now, at the time, I had just taken a 5-day intensive UU history course. So in 5 days, I had heard about the different maneuverings and minutiae of all of the evolving UU theology throughout the ages. And the only thing I could think to say at the moment was, the patron saint of Unitarian Universalism is Inigo Montoya. The patron saint of Unitarian Universalism is Inigo Montoya because I reasoned every time Unitarians or Universalists or Unitarian Universalists looked at the overarching theology, the rule of the church in the day, they took that theology, they studied it, they saw how it was affecting people in their lives, and they said, I don't think that means what you think that means. That is the founding way that Unitarian Universalists have always interacted with dogma. So there was, and this is radical, because once upon a time, it was unthinkable to question Holy Mother Church. Unthinkable. It was after all of the church councils, after the big East-West. Is this one? Okay, all right. Oh, and look at your sound people, just lickety split on the spot. All right. So it was after the big East-West split, but before the Protestant Reformation, there were several hundred years where nobody questioned Holy Mother Church. They had it all worked out. There was a guy with a funny hat in Rome, and he made all the rules, and he told the rules to the other guys in the pretty red dresses, and they told the rules to the priests on the ground. The priests on the ground told the people the rules. And if the people followed the rules, then they could have a gateway to God. They could talk to, they couldn't personally talk to God, but they could talk to their priests who talked to Jesus, who talked to God. It was like this ecclesiastical game of phone tag, but at least they had a system, right? So they had this system in place, and you didn't question it or you get cut off from God, and God is there to protect you. If your family gets sick, goodness knows you need God on your side. Okay, so three things happened. One of them, it seemed that these, we good? All right. I can't keep still, I like to wander. So three things happened. It seemed that these infallible, holy people became fallible when something larger than they can control, when something larger than they could control happened. Enter the bubonic plague. When someone powerful enough to challenge the Pope did, enter Henry VIII. And when enough people heard about it to form a movement, enter the invention of the printing press. So, when the bubonic plague hit, we had all of these holy people saying, give us your money, give us your indulgences, travel to these statues, and your family will be saved. And if it was a little cold or some smallpox that was affecting one area or one family, they could get away with that. But suddenly people saw en masse, that the people that were prescribing the cures were themselves getting sick. And the sickness didn't seem to discriminate between the holy and the worthy and those that were not worthy. In fact, this is a little known fact that's kind of weird and kind of cool. The HEPA virus is a natural inoculant to the bubonic plague. So suddenly it's actually the people that you wouldn't think would be the holy people, the sailors and the ladies that hung around the docks, they were the ones that weren't getting sick. And instead of putting themselves in cathedrals that were gilded and lined with garlic, they were going into people's homes when they found that they weren't getting sick and were helping people and tending to their families in real time. All of this while over in England, it's chaos because church rule depends on which wife of Henry VIII, the current monarch, was born to. And they can't put down the insurgency because Martin Luther had made himself a Renaissance social media star. The people looked at the functioning of the church and they said, infallible? I don't think that means what you think it means. And they took off, and several of them decided to start their own denominations across an ocean and into a new land, which is super problematic, and I'm sure you'll talk about it, but that's not this sermon. And they decided that they were going to make their own rules in their own churches. Then we created congregational polity. How about it? Yes, congregational polity. Only still, the people in charge got to have their own ideas. And the ideas that the people in charge of these Puritan Calvinist churches started saying, all right, so God is infinite and we are all predestined to a fate. And it actually doesn't matter what you do in your life. God's got it. We are all, this was the title of the most famous sermon at the time. We are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. So about the turn of the 19th century, the early 1800s, two groups of people started thinking about this sinners in the hands of an angry God concept. One of them were the Universalists, or the people that would become the Universalists. In 1805, this guy, Hosea Ballou, penned something called the Tretis on Atonement, and in it he argued that the entire concept of atonement, the way the church was talking about it, did not make sense. He's like, wait a minute. You created us, right? This infinite, all-powerful, all-good being creates something that's so flawed that then it needs to atone in order to make the all-powerful being whole? That doesn't make sense to me. He compared God to a father with many, many children. And he said, either that father will provide for all of his children. I know it's gendered language. It was 1805. We're doing the best we can. Either that father will provide for all of his children indiscriminately, whether he thinks they deserve it or not, or he won't. And if he doesn't, either he can't because he doesn't have the means, or he is cruel and he won't. So either we're saying God is not all powerful, or we're saying God is cruel, or salvation has to be universal. He looked at the very concepts of sin and atonement and salvation, and he said, I don't think that means what you think it means. And later, a man named William Ellery Channing from the Unitarian side of things started saying sort of the same things, but in a different way. The old adage goes that Universalists thought God was too good to damn them, and the Unitarians thought they were too good to be damned. Pretty close to the same thing. So Channing writes this sermon called Likeness to God in 1812. And the Puritans have a cow. It is sacrilege. It is sacrilege to say that human beings could possibly achieve the goodness of God. That is ridiculous. So they did their research on him, their oppo research on him, and they found out that Channing was taking out the same books in Europe as this group of scoundrels called the Unitarians. And so they slandered him in the worst way they could possibly think of. They wrote pamphlets and sent them all over Boston calling Channing a Unitarian. And so Channing says, I don't actually know what I think about Unitarian theology. Let me look it up. See, Channing was very, very literate, very literary. He had taught himself ancient Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew so that he could read the Bible in its original form. And when he looked up the only passage in the Bible that talks about the Trinity, it's in John. It says, there are three in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they are three in one. Sounds like the Trinity you've heard about, right? Yeah? Channing translated that for himself based on his reading of the original Greek, and he said, what this says to me is there are three that reside over paradise, the Word, the water, and the way, and those three agree. That doesn't sound like the same thing to me. And so in 1819, he wrote a sermon about it called Unitarian Christianity, and a denomination was born. He looked at the very concept of the Trinity, and he said, I don't think that means what you think it means. And then later, all of these Unitarian ministers started digging into the Bible and retelling the old sacred stories. There was a man named Theodore Parker who in 1834 wrote something called The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. And what he asked us to do was one big old thought experiment. He said, what has been transient throughout the ages is how we think of Jesus. Is he the Son of God? Is he the same substance as God? Is he the essence of God? We keep changing this. But the values that he talked about, that it is our job to love each other and our neighbors, to feed and heal the people, those things have been permanent throughout all of the teachings of Jesus. So let me ask you to think about this, and maybe we can do this thought experiment right now. What if we woke up and found proof that Jesus Christ was a human being, that he was not divine, or maybe that he had never even existed? Would our religion still matter? Would it matter that we gathered here on Sunday mornings to preach about feeding and healing the people and building beloved communities? I think I know our answer, but in 1834, that was really, really radical. But he must have done something right, because throngs of people started coming to Channing's church. He had to rent out an auditorium in Boston in order to fit all the people to hear this new message of how religion should be values-based rather than entirely based on dogma and doctrine. And so then it became a competition. Who can reinterpret religion the best? The more radical you can be, the better. And the more literary you can be, the better. And the place that this was being done really all the time were at divinity school graduations. Because in divinity school, we had all read the Bible and we knew all the minutia and the nuance, right? So in 1837, you know what? I mixed that up. 1834 is this one. 1837 was the Parker one. It doesn't matter. So it's sometime in the 1830s. They get this guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a Unitarian minister known for his literary prowess, to give a divinity school address. And they're like, ooh, how's he going to mess up the Bible to make it fun and cool? And Ralph Waldo Emerson gets up and he stands in the beautiful spring day that it was in late May. And he said, you know, I feel the sun on my face. And I feel the wind in my hair. And I feel my deep connection to all things. And I don't need a book to tell me how to feel about God. It was the time in history when talking about the weather was most controversial. In one fell swoop, Parker and Emerson, well, two fell swoops, got together and said, the concept of the divinity of Christ, of an anthropomorphic God, of the need for Scripture as the primacy of what drives us in our faith, I don't think any of that means what you all think it means. And then, not to leave the Universalists behind, there was a man named Clarence Skinner, who in the 1930s and 40s and 50s looked around the world. He saw the ravages of World War II. He saw the ravages of racism. He saw the ravages of sexism and war. And he said, you know, back in the day, us Universalists took a stand and we said that the thought of the day was that God, we didn't have to think about the poor and the dejected because God wasn't thinking about them. But now it seems like we're saying we don't have to think about the poor and the dejected because God's got them. It went too far the other way. And what I see when I look at actual ghettos during World War II, when I see places that are impoverished, when I see racism and sexism, I see hell on earth. And I think the only way that we're going to create universal salvation is if we save each other here and now by living the values that our religion has taught us. He wrote something called The Social Implications of Universalism, which if I were going to propose a modern day Bible for UUism, it might be that. So here's the thing, folks. We have this amazing history. We have this amazing history of people, our forebears, telling us that it is our job to look at what is right and what is good, that our religion has always compelled us to be people of action and reason, and most importantly, connection and compassion. And so I have to admit that I get a little bit grumpy. I get a little bit grumpy when people tell me that Unitarian Universalism can't be a religion, that we can't call it church. I even sometimes get a little bit grumpy when people tell me that we should throw off our Christian heritage, because I think that we need the authority of that heritage now more than ever. I understand that in the world that we live in, there are people that are trying to define those words, religion, church, even Christianity, in ways that don't mean what we think they mean. But I don't think we should relinquish our claim to that history. Because nowadays we have people using those words. We have people using those words to say that they are pro-gun and pro-war and anti-healthcare, but somehow pro-life. And I think we need not only the grounding of our values, but the authority of our heritage to say, I don't think that means what you think it means. We have people who are talking about building walls and prisons and talking about restricting what a woman gets to choose to do with her own body, and then having the temerity to talk about freedom. And I think we need not just the grounding of our values, but the authority of our tradition to say freedom. I don't think that means what you think it means. We have people who are claiming religion and church and Christian values to say that they are people of family values, but saying that only some families count. I think we need not only the grounding of our values, but the authority of our heritage when we say, nah, friend, you're talking about love. And I know about love. The God that we once shared talked about little else. And I don't think that means what you think it means. May we be so bold and so brave and so loving. Amen.